Like a backseat driver who can't even parallel park but somehow knows you're doing it wrong. Like Uncle Rick at your wedding grabbing the microphone for an unscheduled toast. Like someone yanking the controller away during a video game then asking, "How do you jump?" Like a passenger grabbing the steering wheel because they know a better route even though they're 95, don't drive, and are legally blind. Like a guy who watches one YouTube video and suddenly thinks he can rewire his entire house. Every time I speak, I already know without a shadow of a doubt that someone somewhere is going to disagree with me. And the range of that disagreement, well, it's vast. It stretches all the way from a mild church-friendly, I'm not sure about that, to a full-blown, you are nothing but the pawn of Satan himself. Which, by the way, is a very interesting approach to theological discussions. But these disagreements aren't just about ideas. It's about character, integrity, and apparently whether or not I'm personally responsible for the downfall of Western civilization. But here's what's even more concerning. It's apparently not enough to just spew rhetoric anymore. No, right now there's a growing wave where certain groups of people who don't share your beliefs, who have never publicly even commented on your faith, or their own for that matter, who simply want to go about their lives in peace, must suddenly be condemned, threatened, or legislated into non-existence for the crime of existing. And of course, it's all framed as a noble effort to bring people to Christ. Because nothing screams the love of Jesus like foaming at the mouth threats of eternal torment. Which, quick question, how's that strategy working for you? Have you saved a lot of souls with that one lately? No? Interesting. But then, when other Christians or faith communities dare to actually stand up for the marginalized, the broken, the condemned, like Jesus actually told us to do, those people are shoved into the comment section of hell. So let's test this whole self-assured rhetorical judgment, shall we? Let's take a walk down memory lane and look at a very familiar Sunday school story. Jonah. No, not the part with the whale. The rest of the story. God says, "Hey Jonah, go to Nineveh." Jonah replies, no. Then boards a ship in the opposite direction. God sends a storm. Jonah gets tossed overboard by the sailors for being a deadbeat prophet, gets swallowed by a fish, has an appropriate amount of existential panic, repents, as one tends to do inside the belly of a fish, gets vomited onto dry land, and finally reluctantly obeys. That's the story, right? Jonah, the scared little prophet, finally musters the courage to fulfill his divine mission? Well, not exactly. What if I told you that Jonah wasn't afraid of the vicious Ninevites, but instead because he didn't actually want Nineveh to repent at all? Oh yes, buckle up, because we're about to ruin your memory of VeggieTales. See, Jonah does eventually go to Nineveh. He does preach, and wouldn't you know it, Nineveh actually listens. The entire city repents, puts on sackcloth, sits in ashes from king to peasant. And how does Jonah react? Does he celebrate? Does he weep for joy? No, he throws a tantrum. Jonah chapter 4, verse 1 and 2. I'm going to paraphrase it. Jonah was furious. He thought this was completely unfair. He said, see, this is exactly why I didn't want to come here. I knew you would do this, God. I knew you were a kind and merciful God, slow to anger and overflowing with love. I knew that you'd give him a second chance, turn things around, and now look, these people get mercy? Jonah wasn't afraid of failing. Jonah was afraid of succeeding. And that's where the story really gets uncomfortable. Jonah was mad that God was merciful after the city repented. He literally parked himself outside the city, waiting for God to change his mind or come to his senses and begin the divine fireworks show anyway. So God decides to take Jonah to school. According to the story, God miraculously sends a plant to grow and shade Jonah from the sun. Jonah's quite pleased with this. Then that night, God sends a worm to kill the plant. And Jonah, well, he's no longer pleased. And God responds with, really, Jonah? You're mad over a plant, but you were completely fine with an entire city of 120,000 people being wiped off the face of the earth? You see, at this point, this isn't just an ancient story about a begrudging prophet. Now, this is a story about us. This is the Christian who gets angry when the wrong people receive mercy or even offered mercy. This is the religious leader who decides who is worthy of God's grace and who isn't. This is the person who has already filled in all the blanks and missing details of Bible stories in order to imbue motives and reasons that are not there. And let's be clear about that last point. We don't know the specifics of Nineveh's wickedness. We don't know what they did to repent beyond sitting in sackcloth and ashes. And there isn't any indication that the Ninevites suddenly became Jewish converts. But that hasn't stopped people from making some really big assumptions, not just with this story, but a lot of Bible stories. But I digress. So here's the next and really hard question. Who are we in this story? Are we Jonah, so convinced that we're right that we'd rather watch people burn than see them receive mercy? Are we Nineveh, imperfect but willing to listen, reflect, and change? Maybe we're the shade plant. Not really sure how to apply that one. Because here's the thing, Jonah thought he knew exactly who deserved judgment and who didn't. But last I heard, God is not taking applications for the position of judge of all earth. So maybe, just maybe, before we start reveling in our own judgment of people we disagree with, before we start deciding that this group of people who are obviously beyond saving should just be preemptively judged and shoved back into the shadows of society, before we start dragging people who do try to extend mercy, dignity, and love to marginalized groups like Jesus taught us to do into the comment section of hell, we should remember that God's mercy is bigger and greater than we are. We might want to think before we yank that decision from God like a toddler who decides they can do it themselves and end up covered in spaghetti and regret. And if that makes us uncomfortable, well, that says a lot more about us than it does about anything else. Wouldn't you agree? I'm Jon DeHoyos. Peace, love, and tortillas.